Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In the Americas, we look at Jamaica's long road to recovery after Hurricane Melissa, the strongest storm in the country's history, and at the fallout from Brazil's deadliest ever police raid in Rio de Janeiro. In Europe, the Middle East and Africa, we assess the worsening situation in Pokrovsk as Russian forces push to claim the city, evacuation guidance from the US Embassy in Mali amid a militant fuel blockade, and the Rapid Support Forces capture of El Fasher in Sudan, which has been marked by mass civilian killings. We also look at violent unrest following contested elections in Cameroon and Tanzania. And in Asia-Pacific, we examine the collapse of peace talks between Afghanistan and Pakistan and the devastating floods across central Vietnam. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where Jamaica begins to recover from the devastation of Hurricane Melissa, the strongest storm ever recorded in the country. On October 28th, Hurricane Melissa made landfall on Jamaica's southwest coast at full Category 5 strength, bringing maximum recorded wind speeds of 296 kilometers per hour. The Global Disaster Alert and Coordination System anticipated that the hurricane could have a severe humanitarian impact, exposing around 3 million people to Category 1 or higher wind speeds and generating a maximum storm surge of 0.9 meters. In advance of the storm, Jamaican authorities issued mandatory evacuation orders for high-risk areas, temporarily closed Norman Manley International Airport in Kingston and Sangster International Airport in Montego Bay, and opened hundreds of shelters across the island. The damage caused by Hurricane Melissa has been severe, with St. Elizabeth Parish among the worst affected regions. At least 8 people have been confirmed dead, and early estimates put the total cost of the destruction at around $22 billion. The hurricane also had a severe impact across Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, the Bahamas, and the Turks and Caicos Islands. In Cuba, Hurricane Melissa made landfall near the city of Santiago de Cuba at Category 3 strength. Anticipating the storm's arrival, Cuban authorities evacuated more than 735,000 people from vulnerable areas. Further east, the hurricane's outer bands brought intense rainfall and landslides to Haiti and the Dominican Republic. In Haiti alone, at least 25 people have been reported dead as a result of the storm. Now our intelligence team's assessment. Hurricane Melissa is the 13th named storm of the 2025 Atlantic hurricane season, which runs from June to November. The U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration had previously forecast an above-normal season, with between 13 and 18 named storms and 3 to 5 major hurricanes. Melissa is the third Category 5 hurricane of the season. However, unlike the other Category 5 storms, Erin and Humberto, which reached peak intensity further east over the Atlantic, Melissa made direct landfall in Jamaica and later in Cuba, resulting in far more severe impacts. The hurricane's slow movement also likely intensified the destruction, prolonging exposure to high winds, heavy rain, and storm surges. A country's disaster resilience, which depends on factors such as preparedness measures, infrastructure quality, building standards, and emergency response capacity, remains the most critical determinant of a natural disaster's impact. Jamaica is assessed by the Global Disaster Alert and Coordination System as having medium vulnerability. In the summer of 2024, Hurricane Beryl caused at least 4 deaths and around $204 million in damage. Many of the areas worst affected by Hurricane Melissa were still recovering from Beryl's impact, compounding the scale of destruction this year. So far, no fatalities have been reported in Cuba, with extensive evacuation measures almost certainly preventing a higher loss of life. Over the past year, Cuba has experienced widespread power blackouts that have severely strained the country's energy infrastructure and, at times, triggered rare instances of civil unrest. These existing challenges are now almost certain to be worsened by the damage caused by Hurricane Melissa. It is highly unlikely that Sangster International Airport, located on Jamaica's northern coast in the Montego Bay area, will reopen in the near future. The airport was far more directly impacted by the hurricane than Kingston and Norman Manley International Airport. As of the morning of October 30th, American Airlines has announced the resumption of operations in Kingston, Jamaica, Holguin, Cuba, and Providenciales in the Turks and Caicos Islands. It will almost certainly take years for Jamaica to recover fully from the devastation caused by Hurricane Melissa, the strongest storm in the nation's history. The disaster underscores both the growing severity of storm systems driven by climate change and the urgent need for stronger resilience measures and improved disaster preparedness. Staying in the region, in Brazil, a large-scale police raid in Rio de Janeiro has become the deadliest in the state's history. On October 28th, Brazilian police launched Operation Containment, a series of large-scale raids across Rio de Janeiro state, involving more than 2,500 officers and Special Forces troops. The operation targeted Comando Vermelho, or CV, a powerful militia and organized criminal group with a significant presence across Rio's favelas. Throughout the day, police and CV members engaged in heavy clashes, with reports indicating that the group used drone-dropped grenades against security forces. According to local media reports, the raid resulted in at least 132 deaths, including 4 police officers, and led to more than 113 arrests. This makes it the deadliest police operation in Rio de Janeiro's history, surpassing the 1992 Carandiru prison massacre. In the aftermath of the raid, several road blockades were reported across Rio de Janeiro state, believed to have been organized by Comando Vermelho in retaliation for the operation. Now our assessment. As its name suggests, the operation was intended to counter Comando Vermelho's expanding influence across Rio de Janeiro state. In recent months, the group has been involved in frequent clashes with rival militias in the Jacarepagua region in Rio's southwest. According to local media, these confrontations form part of a broader nationalization strategy by CV, an effort to extend its reach into territories traditionally outside its control, while also building or strengthening alliances with smaller local criminal groups. The operation took place only weeks before Brazil is set to host the COP30 summit, which is expected to bring a surge of high-profile international visitors to the country. Although Belém, the summit's host city, is located more than 2,000 kilometers from Rio de Janeiro in the state of Pará, the event is still likely to increase international arrivals to Rio and other major Brazilian cities. There is a realistic possibility that the timing of the operation was deliberate, aimed at weakening Comando Vermelho, the dominant criminal organization in Pará, ahead of the summit. Overall, it is likely too early to determine the true effectiveness of the operation. Early reports, however, suggest that the raid failed to deliver any meaningful blow to Comando Vermelho. Authorities have noted that while several high-ranking CV members were arrested or killed, the operation did not succeed in capturing Edgar Alves Andrade, known as Doca da Penha, one of the group's key leaders believed to operate within the Complexo do Alemão and Penha favelas. The exceptionally high death toll is also expected to draw widespread domestic criticism. Police operations in Rio have long been condemned for causing disproportionately high civilian casualties, particularly in already marginalized communities. For Comando Vermelho, which often portrays itself as an alternative source of welfare and protection in impoverished informal settlements, the scale of the violence is likely to provide an opportunity to bolster recruitment. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East and Africa, where Ukraine's battle for Pokrovsk has reached a critical stage as Russian forces intensify their assault. Amid the renewed Russian offensive against Pokrovsk in Donetsk Oblast, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stated on October 27th that Ukrainian forces in the besieged city are currently outnumbered 8-1. Russia's chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, claimed a day earlier that around 5,500 Ukrainian soldiers had been encircled in and around Pokrovsk, a claim Zelensky dismissed as a complete lie. Ukrainian officials have reported that around 200 Russian troops have entered central Pokrovsk, with earlier footage from Ukraine's 7th Rapid Reaction Corps showing strikes against Russian positions at a railway station in the city center. In addition to small groups of Russian troops entering Pokrovsk from the southwest, Russian forces have intensified their offensive towards Myrnohrad, a city roughly 6 kilometers northeast of Pokrovsk, situated along the T0504 highway. This route serves as a key supply line connecting the Eastern Front with the city of Dnipro. Open-source intelligence mapping now suggests that the Ukrainian-controlled corridor out of the Pokrovsk-Myrnohrad pocket has narrowed to less than 3 kilometers. Now our team's assessment. Pokrovsk, which had a pre-war population of around 60,000, has served as a key transportation and logistics hub for Ukrainian forces operating along the front lines in Donetsk Oblast. The loss of Pokrovsk would represent a significant battlefield setback for Ukraine, potentially paving the way for further Russian advances into Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. It could also enable future Russian offensives aimed at encircling the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration. However, Russia's offensive along the Pokrovsk axis began in the summer of 2024 and has progressed only slowly, with heavy casualties on the Russian side. Any future attempts to expand these gains are therefore highly likely to come at similarly high cost. Compared with the Battle of Bakhmut more than 2.5 years ago, which was marked by intense house-to-house fighting and the use of large numbers of armored vehicles, the battle for Pokrovsk has taken on a different character. Here, small groups of infantry have been able to exert control over entire streets, supported by extensive use of first-person view drones, artillery and airstrikes targeting ground lines of communication. Ukrainian troops entering the Pokrovsk pocket come under sustained drone attack, forcing defenders to rely increasingly on uncrewed ground vehicles for resupply and transport. Russian claims of a full encirclement are likely exaggerated, and Ukraine's continued defense of Pokrovsk suggests that a rapid Russian breakthrough remains unlikely. However, the high casualty rates and sustained attrition among Ukrainian units could eventually force a tactical withdrawal. Such a move would aim to preserve combat effectiveness, re-establish stable front lines, and avoid the risk of encirclement. Even so, while Ukrainian forces in Pokrovsk may not yet be physically surrounded, the persistent attacks on their ground lines of communication by drones and indirect fire have likely created conditions that are, in practice, functionally equivalent to encirclement. Reports suggest that Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered the capture of Pokrovsk by mid-November. If accurate, this would almost certainly reflect a strong desire within the Kremlin to reinforce its claims over the Donbas region. Both the U.S. administration under Donald Trump and the Ukrainian government are currently advocating for a freezing of the conflict along the existing front lines. However, the proposed U.S.-Russia Budapest summit has almost certainly been called off following Moscow's refusal to engage in any negotiations that do not include full Russian annexation of the Donbas. For Kyiv, conceding the remaining Ukrainian-held areas of the Donbas, which include the highly defensible fortress belt, is not a viable option. Doing so would eliminate critical defensive depth and significantly increase the vulnerability of other regions of Ukraine to future Russian offensives. Pressures on the Kremlin are highly likely mounting as a result of Ukraine's successful strikes against Russia's oil and gas industry, alongside new sanctions imposed by the Trump administration on Rosneft and Lukoil, Russia's two largest oil companies. On October 30th, Lukoil announced plans to sell its foreign assets to the multinational Governor Group in response to these sanctions. Moscow is therefore highly likely to continue committing substantial resources and manpower to the battlefield in an effort to force the ceding of the Donbass. Any capture of Pokrovsk would almost certainly be used by the Kremlin to press for maximalist concessions, both diplomatically and in any future negotiations over the conflict's outcome. In Mali, the U.S. Embassy has urged citizens to leave the country amid severe fuel shortages and growing militant blockades on supply routes. On October 28th, the U.S. Embassy in Bamako issued an evacuation order, urging all U.S. citizens in Mali to depart immediately. The announcement followed a decision on October 24th by the U.S. State Department to authorize the departure of non-emergency government personnel and their family members, warning that the U.S. government cannot offer routine or emergency services to U.S. citizens outside of Bamako due to safety risks. Mali is currently under a Level 4 Do Not Travel advisory, the highest alert level issued by the State Department. The following day, on October 29th, the Italian Foreign Ministry released a similar statement, urging all Italian nationals in Mali to leave the country as soon as possible. Now, our team's assessment, the U.S. evacuation order was almost certainly issued in response to the ongoing fuel blockade imposed by Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin, or JNIM, an al-Qaeda-linked militant coalition. The blockade, which began in September, has targeted fuel convoys traveling along key overland supply routes linking Bamako with Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal, the corridors through which most of Mali's fuel imports are transported. As a result, the country has experienced severe fuel shortages, reduced energy output, and widespread disruption to both commercial and humanitarian logistics. The junta government has been forced to close all schools and universities. The junta government, already struggling to contain the JNIM insurgency and facing renewed offensives from Tuareg separatists and other armed factions following the expulsion of Western forces, is now almost certain to prioritize regime survival. This will likely involve diverting the remaining fuel reserves to sustain military operations and maintain electricity generation in an effort to prevent large-scale civil unrest. As a result, critical fuel shortages are highly likely to affect civilian sectors, including commercial aviation and transportation. These shortages will almost certainly restrict evacuation options by air if the security situation deteriorates further, while overland routes remain assessed as too dangerous due to the persistent threat posed by militant groups. JNIM's strategy likely aims to gradually isolate Bamako, thereby weakening the junta government and allowing the group to position itself as an alternative governing authority. This approach would almost certainly enhance the effectiveness of its recruitment and propaganda efforts. Prolonged fuel shortages are expected to trigger widespread energy disruptions, drive up the cost of essential goods, and strain public services. Over time, these conditions are likely to fuel growing anti-government sentiment, raising the risk of significant and potentially violent civil unrest or even another coup. Mali has already experienced 2 coups, along with several alleged attempts in recent years. Initial reports suggest that the junta is seeking to secure a fuel supply agreement and additional logistical support from Russia through the Africa Corps, formerly known as the Wagner Group. This move is likely to deepen Bamako's strategic alignment with Moscow, providing short-term support for regime survival. However, it will almost certainly come at the cost of further international isolation for the junta, reinforcing the decline of Western influence in Mali. In Sudan, the Rapid Support Forces have captured El Fasher after months of siege, carrying out widespread executions of civilians. On October 28th, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, Sudan's military chief, confirmed that the Sudanese armed forces had withdrawn from El Fasher, the capital of North Darfur. According to his statement, the withdrawal was negotiated with local leaders in an effort to prevent what he described as the systematic destruction and killing of civilians, a tactic the Rapid Support Forces have repeatedly employed throughout the 18-month siege. Footage shared on social media shows RSF fighters celebrating around the former military base in El Fasher, as well as shooting, beating, and detaining civilians attempting to flee the city. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, RSF forces carried out ethnically motivated, summary executions of civilians following the city's capture. The Sudan Doctor Network has also accused RSF fighters of looting hospitals and medical facilities, effectively destroying what remained of El Fasher's healthcare infrastructure. The governor of Darfur has stated that at least 460 patients were killed during an RSF attack on a Saudi maternity hospital in the city. At least 26,000 people were displaced from El Fasher between October 26th and 27th, while more than 3,000 have arrived in Tawila, around 60 kilometers southwest of the city, since October 18th. According to the UNHCR, many of those fleeing are starving or injured. Among a sample of 165 children, 75% were found to be malnourished, with a quarter of them in very severe condition. Approximately 260,000 people remain in El Fasher under RSF control, and about half of them are children. Now our assessment. El Fasher, which had been under siege by the RSF since April 2024, was the last major Sudanese armed forces stronghold in Darfur. Its capture cements RSF dominance across the region and almost certainly marks the most significant strategic turning point in the conflict since the SAF's recapture of Khartoum in March 2025, an event that almost certainly spurred the RSF to escalate its campaign to seize El Fasher. Following the capture of Khartoum, the RSF declared itself a rival governing authority, calling it the Government of Peace and Unity. The fall of El Fasher now highly likely creates a de facto division within Sudan, with the north and east controlled by the SAF and the west dominated by the RSF. This shift will almost certainly make it even more difficult for the Sudanese armed forces to regain control of Darfur, effectively entrenching the conflict along the current front lines. The capture of El Fasher will almost certainly deepen Sudan's already dire humanitarian crisis, as the city had served as the primary entry point for aid convoys, delivering assistance to Darfur. It will also highly likely lead to an escalation in ethnically motivated killings. The conflict in Sudan has increasingly taken on a pronounced ethnic dimension, with mobilization along ethnic lines fueling widespread atrocities against civilians. The RSF has drawn much of its recruitment from Arab tribal groups in western and central Sudan, including the Hawazma, Kanana, and Misraya communities in South Kordofan. By framing its campaign around an Arab versus non-Arab identity, the RSF has contributed to the growing targeting of non-Arab ethnic groups throughout the war. The deliberate targeting of civilians in El Fasher during the siege was highly likely intended to worsen the city's humanitarian conditions, sever supply lines, undermine morale, and increase pressure on the Sudanese armed forces. This approach has almost certainly blurred the distinction between combatant and non-combatant, reinforcing the perception that civilians are legitimate targets. The success of this tactic in forcing the SAF's withdrawal from the city strongly suggests that the RSF will continue to employ it, making further attacks on civilians highly likely. Widespread reports of RSF atrocities in El Fasher will almost certainly increase international pressure on the United Arab Emirates, which has been accused of supporting the RSF through arms transfers and logistical assistance, particularly following the group's loss of Khartoum. Although the UAE has denied these allegations, US intelligence agencies have accused it of providing the RSF with Chinese-made, military-grade fixed-wing drones capable of precision targeting. This support has highly likely contributed to the RSF's capture of El Fasher and helped sustain the wider conflict. While the US remains a key ally of the UAE and has not formally accused it of backing the RSF, these reports almost certainly complicate ongoing peace efforts. The International Criminal Court is currently investigating alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity in Sudan, and any perception of UAE complicity could trigger protests in Western countries, including the United States. We move on to Cameroon, where deadly unrest has erupted after disputed election results declared President Paul Biya the winner. On October 26th, the eve of the official announcement, civil unrest broke out across several cities. In Douala, protesters reportedly attacked a gendarmerie brigade and several police stations, resulting in the deaths of 4 people during clashes with security forces. In Garua, supporters of opposition candidate Bakari also clashed with police, who used tear gas to disperse the crowds. The following morning, Cameroon's Constitutional Council declared incumbent President Paul Biya the winner, securing an 8th 7-year term with 53.66% of the vote. Opposition leader Chiroma Bakari, Biya's main challenger, came second with 35.19% of the vote. Shortly after the election results were announced, Chiroma Bakari claimed that the military had opened fire on civilians outside his residence in Garua, with unconfirmed reports suggesting that 2 people were killed. Unverified images shared on social media appeared to show gunmen positioned on the roof of a house near Bakari's home. Demonstrations quickly erupted in Douala, Cameroon's largest city, and spread to several others, including Yaoundé, Banja, Bafoussam, and Melong. The protests soon escalated into violent clashes and acts of arson, with fires set on roads in Yaoundé, and the ruling party headquarters burned down in Melong. Security forces responded with force, and there were reports of live gunfire being used against protesters. While further protests were anticipated on October 28th, heavy rain and a strong security presence in Douala prevented large-scale demonstrations. Smaller gatherings were quickly dispersed by security forces. A video circulating on social media appeared to show gunfire being fired from security force vehicles in the town of Bafoussam, though it remains unclear what the targets were. Meanwhile, crowds also assembled in the Odza and Ekunu neighborhoods of Yaoundé. On October 29th, protesters gathered in Douala's Bilongué neighborhood after reports that security forces had shot and killed a civilian earlier in the day. In Maroua's second district, demonstrators reportedly stormed a police station. A day earlier, on October 28th, Abdul Raufou, Secretary-General of the Cameroonian Party for National Reconciliation, resigned from the party, citing disagreement with its decision to recognize President Biya's electoral victory. Interior Minister Paul Atanganji has since announced that opposition leader Chiroma Bakari will face legal action, accusing him of inciting violent post-election demonstrations. Bakari has vowed to continue resisting and has called on his supporters to mobilize. Since October 26th, at least 23 people have been killed in the clashes. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The election results followed weeks of mounting tension in Cameroon. On October 14th, opposition leader Chiroma Bakari unilaterally declared victory in a 5-minute speech posted on social media, in which he urged President Paul Biya to concede defeat. The following day, October 15th, protests broke out in several cities over alleged vote-counting irregularities. Clashes were reported in Douala, Chang, Kuseri, and Limbe as demonstrators took to the streets to challenge the integrity of the electoral process. In Dichang, protesters set fire to the courthouse, the public prosecutor's office, and the headquarters of the ruling Cameroon People's Democratic Movement. Police responded with tear gas and carried out multiple arrests. Further demonstrations took place on October 21st in Garua, in the country's north, in support of Bakari. Authorities reported that at least 20 people were arrested during the protests, and one teacher was reportedly shot dead. Bakari's declaration of victory is highly likely to be viewed by the opposition as an opportunity to challenge and potentially unseat the current government, almost certainly taking inspiration from recent protest movements in Nepal and Madagascar. Cameroon's 2018 election also sparked nationwide demonstrations, led by opposition figure Maurice Kamto, which were met with a heavy-handed government crackdown and the use of excessive force. Security forces have shown similar behavior in response to the latest wave of unrest, and any future anti-government protests would almost certainly face severe repression. Security forces are highly likely to employ live ammunition, crowd dispersal tactics such as tear gas and water cannon, along with internet shutdowns and mass arrests to suppress dissent. There is a realistic possibility that protests will continue to intensify across major cities and Bakari strongholds such as Douala, Yaoundé, and Dichang, with the unrest potentially spreading nationwide. A significant share of the population almost certainly believes the vote count was manipulated, and there is a realistic possibility that they will mobilize in large numbers in support of Bakari. If civil unrest escalates further, disruptions at airports are likely, with airlines potentially cancelling flights and roadblocks hindering access to major transport hubs. Authorities could also impose curfews, adding to the disruption of movement and daily activity. However, heavy rain prevented demonstrations from significantly escalating on October 28th. Cameroon is currently in the midst of its rainy season, which runs from April to November. Forecasts indicate that heavy rainfall will continue until at least November 11th in Douala, the city most likely to experience violent unrest. This weather pattern presents a realistic possibility that large-scale gatherings will be hindered in the coming weeks. In addition, the forceful crackdowns by security forces on earlier demonstrations are likely to deter many from participating in further protests. And in Tanzania, protests have turned violent during the general election, with reports of live ammunition used against demonstrators. On October 29th, Tanzanians went to the polls to elect a president for a 5-year term, along with members of parliament and local councillors. Incumbent President Samia Suluhu Hassan is standing for re-election, representing the ruling Chama cha Mapinduzi party. Civil unrest has erupted in Dar es Salaam, where protesters gathered along major highways, demanding electoral reforms and fair elections. Security forces used tear gas to disperse opposition supporters in the Kimara Kibo area, with footage shared on social media showing demonstrators throwing rocks in response. In the nearby Kimara Baruti area, protesters set fire to a bus station, while further demonstrations were reported in Magomeni, Ubongo, Kinondoni, Shekilango, and Tandale. Several polling stations have reportedly been attacked and multiple protesters injured. Amnesty International has stated that at least 2 people were killed. The internet monitoring group NetBlocks reported a nationwide internet disruption, and authorities imposed an overnight curfew in Dar es Salaam from 6 p.m. on October 29th through the morning of October 30th. Protests continued on October 30th, with security forces firing live ammunition and deploying tear gas in Dar es Salaam as demonstrators returned to the streets. The unrest has been concentrated in the Mbagala, Gongo Lamboto, and Kiluvya areas. Eyewitness footage shows thick smoke rising from Namanga near the Kenyan border after a fire was set along the road. Social media videos also appear to show protesters entering Julius Nyerere International Airport. Further demonstrations, including possible marches on government buildings, have reportedly been discussed on Zello, a mobile application that allows users to communicate via walkie-talkie-style channels. The U.S. Embassy in Tanzania has advised U.S. government personnel to shelter in place, avoid demonstrations and large gatherings, maintain a low profile, monitor local media for updates, and remain alert to their surroundings. The embassy also reported that several major roads, including the main route to Julius Nyerere International Airport, have been closed. Some international flights to and from the airport have been cancelled, while Arusha Airport has been temporarily shut down. In response to the unrest, Tanzanian authorities have instructed civil servants and students to work and study from home until further notice. Now our intelligence assessment. The Chama cha Mapinduzi Party has held power in Tanzania since independence in 1961, initially through its predecessor, the Tanzania African National Union. Since the 2015 election, in which CCM secured its smallest vote share of 58%, the government has grown increasingly authoritarian. Under incumbent President Samia Suluhu Hassan, authorities have intensified crackdowns on opposition parties, civil society organizations, and the press. The main opposition party, the Party for Democracy and Progress, was barred from contesting the election in April 2025. Its leader, Tundu Lissu, was arrested and charged with treason following pro-democracy protests. Luhaga Mpina, the presidential candidate for the Alliance for Change and Transparency, Wazalendo, ACT Wazalendo, was also disqualified from entering the race, with authorities citing alleged procedural irregularities in the party's nomination process. The general election is widely viewed as consolidating the continuation of Chama cha Mapinduzi's rule, with the party facing little meaningful opposition. Elections since 2015 have been characterized by systematic fraud, intimidation, and obstruction, according to observers. Results have consistently favored the ruling party, with CCM winning 98.7% of the vote in the 2020 parliamentary elections and 99.3% in the November 2024 local government elections. The current general election is therefore highly likely to produce similarly inflated figures. Tanzania has a long history of responding harshly to civil unrest. After the 2020 elections, protests over government corruption broke out in Zanzibar, where security forces, including soldiers, police, and a militia linked to Chama cha Mapinduzi, responded with force. Reports indicated that civilians were beaten and live ammunition was used against demonstrators, resulting in 9 deaths. In January 2024, thousands again took to the streets to demand constitutional reforms aimed at overhauling the Electoral Commission and reducing presidential powers. Authorities are highly likely to clamp down on public gatherings in an effort to prevent the protests from gaining momentum. If demonstrations persist, the government will almost certainly respond with mass arrests, as well as the use of tear gas, water cannon, and live ammunition to disperse crowds. Widespread internet shutdowns are also almost certainly being imposed to curb the spread of anti-government sentiment, particularly among younger populations. This follows recent large-scale Gen Z protest movements in Nepal and Madagascar, which resulted in the ousting of their respective governments. There is a realistic possibility that major protests will continue to spread across Tanzania's urban centers, including Dodoma and Zanzibar, where reports suggest that military personnel have already been deployed. If civil unrest escalates further, disruptions at airports are likely. Airlines may cancel flights, and roadblocks could restrict access to major transport hubs. Finally, in Asia-Pacific, the collapse of peace talks between Afghanistan and Pakistan has raised fears of renewed border clashes and airstrikes. 3 days of negotiations between Pakistan and the Taliban, held in Istanbul, concluded on October 28 without reaching an agreement. The talks followed a Qatari-brokered ceasefire established in Doha on October 19. Both sides have blamed each other for the failure of the discussions. Islamabad has accused Kabul of harboring Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan militants, while the Taliban government has in turn accused Pakistan of conducting repeated cross-border airstrikes and causing civilian casualties. On October 29th, following the breakdown of the talks, Pakistan's defense minister threatened to obliterate the Taliban, claiming that Pakistan would not need to use even a fraction of its full arsenal to do so. Now our assessment. The collapse of the peace talks will almost certainly heighten the risk of renewed cross-border violence along the Durand Line, the 2,640-kilometer border separating Pakistan and Afghanistan. Minor clashes were reported even during the talks, and these are likely to increase in both frequency and intensity until a resolution is reached, potentially leading to prolonged border closures. Unverified internal reports suggest that another round of peace talks may be convened in Istanbul, though this remains uncertain. Until a formal peace agreement is achieved, continued border closures and trade disruptions will almost certainly worsen Afghanistan's already fragile economy and deepen its humanitarian crisis, causing severe shortages of essential goods, such as food, medicine, and fuel. While the talks remain stalled, Pakistan is highly likely to continue conducting airstrikes in Afghanistan, targeting Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan militants. These operations have increasingly included strikes in Kabul and other major population centers. The TTP remains a distinct entity from the Afghan Taliban, with its own leadership, organizational structure, and network. The Taliban's ability to control the group is likely limited, and with the TTP having carried out more than 600 attacks in Pakistan in 2025, Kabul will almost certainly struggle to rein in its activities. Retaliatory Pakistani airstrikes in Afghanistan are likely to become a recurring element of Islamabad's counter-militancy strategy, particularly following high-profile TTP attacks. The Afghan Taliban's continued inability or unwillingness to restrain the group may also heighten the risk of Pakistan directly targeting Taliban leadership and infrastructure suspected of supporting or sheltering TTP militants. And in Vietnam, severe flooding across central regions has left at least 10 people dead and caused widespread disruption in major cities, including Da Nang and Hue. Since October 27, 2025, heavy rainfall has triggered extensive flooding across central Vietnam, with Da Nang, Quang Ngai, Hue, and the tourist town of Hoi An among the worst affected areas. As of October 30th, at least 10 deaths and dozens of injuries have been confirmed. A state of emergency has been declared in Da Nang due to major transport disruptions, while heavy rains have cut off access to several rural communities. In Hue City, flooding has destroyed key infrastructure, including the Leno Bridge in Khe Tre commune, and left more than 200,000 households without electricity. The rising waters also forced the evacuation of Hue Central Hospital in the Thuan Hoa district. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The ongoing flooding has been caused by tropical depression Fengshen, which formed on October 12th and reached peak intensity over the South China Sea. Vietnam has faced an unusually severe tropical storm season this year, with typhoons Buoloi and Matmo killing at least 12 people earlier in October. Typically, the country's storm season runs from June to October, with peak activity in late summer. However, emerging evidence suggests that the season is now extending beyond its traditional peak months of August to October, with an increasing number of storms forming and intensifying into November. The ongoing flooding has also affected other major urban centers, including Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, though to a lesser extent, and is likely to have caused significant disruption. Damage to roads, bridges, and electricity networks is expected to lead to prolonged interruptions to transport, emergency response, and public health services. Contaminated floodwaters have also increased the risk of disease outbreaks, including dengue, leptospirosis, and other waterborne infections. The restoration of essential infrastructure and utilities is likely to take several weeks, particularly in rural and coastal areas where access remains severely restricted due to landslides and damaged road networks. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solaceglobal.com. Thank you for listening.